technically what happens when the government spends, it literally just creates more Australian dollars. It literally just types numbers on a keyboard and that appears in someone's bank account. That's how it happens. That's the magic.
Big questions, small questions. The ones that you ask the internet at 1 a.m. Our research experts have the answers to those everyday curiosities. Like,
have you ever wondered how the Australian government spends money? I'm Matt Crocker from Deakin University, and I'm going to tell you how. All right, where does the Australian federal government's money actually come from? I think probably the best way to answer this question is that the Australian government makes the money. So the notes get made by a printing press that's owned by the government. It's in Craigieburn, Melbourne, and the coins get made by the Royal Australian Mint in Canberra, but most of the money that we interact with, and certainly how the government actually spends, well, that all comes from the Reserve Bank of Australia. I think, where does it come from? Well, the government just makes it. Okay, what is the difference between money and currency? Well, I'm glad I got this question because I think it's a really important distinction and one that I think economists and people in general don't really make. So we have currency, which is what is created by the government. So you have Australian notes or coins, or the digital equivalent of that, which is central bank money, which is created by the Reserve Bank of Australia. The important thing is only the Australian government can make currency. Money, therefore, is a promise to provide or transfer currency. And so in Australia, and this is true for any economy, most of the money is actually created by commercial banks. So any time anyone goes to a bank checks the person is creditworthy, got a job, they're going to repay the loan. When that loan is created, new money is just created. The bank just did it out of thin air because they have a license to do that. To use an example, say if you're wanting to get a home loan and you go to Bank A and Bank A gives you a $500,000 loan, they literally just create $500,000 and that $500,000 appears in your bank account. And so say if you're buying a house from someone at another bank, so they're at Bank B, what happens is Bank A needs to pay Bank B. How do they do that? They need to have access to currency. Each bank has a bank account at the Reserve Bank of Australia. And so when you want to pay $500,000 to the homeowner, Bank A will debit its account at the Reserve Bank of Australia by $500,000 and Bank B's balance will increase by $500,000. The important thing is that all of that currency, that can only come from the government. If the government stopped collecting taxes for a year, what would happen? In terms of how the system actually operates, nothing. Like nothing, it wouldn't actually matter. Politically speaking, I think it'd be a big issue. There'd be people up in arms going, government's going to run out of money and whatnot. But yeah, nothing would happen. But that's not to say that we shouldn't tax. I don't want to be called that. You can't tax. Taxes are good, but they're not. Taxes don't finance government spending. Taxes, they affect people's behaviour. You want people to smoke less, you make smoking expensive. You want people to drive electric vehicle cars, you provide a subsidy, a tax subsidy encourages that. That's what taxes do. But then they can also change the distribution of wealth. If you believe that we want to have a society where we don't have really wealthy people, you can put in a progressive tax system and take away people's spending power. If you think that the reason you've got inflation is because there's too much money, too much currency out there, well, you can also use taxes to sort of dampen those inflationary pressures as well. But they don't finance spending. Is it true that governments just print more money whenever they want? Yeah, more or less. I don't like using the word print money because I think as soon as we think printing money, it has this negative connotation and we think all of a sudden that government spending is a bad thing. But, if we think about technically what happens when the government spends, it literally just creates more Australian dollars. It all happens digitally, and so when the government spends, it literally just types numbers on a keyboard and that appears in someone's bank account. That's how it happens. That's the magic. When the government borrows money, where does it come from? Whenever the government borrows, it does that by issuing debt securities. So these pieces of paper that are called government treasury bonds, they're effectively just IOUs. But to be able to purchase a government IOU, you need Australian dollars. So any previous spending from the Australian government creates Australian dollars and puts them out into the economy. And so anyone who has Australian dollars can buy that government debt. But the people that really buy the government debt are the big banks or big superannuation funds, those kind of entities. Often when we think about government debt, public debt, we think, we're borrowing from China or we're borrowing from Japan or whatever. But the important thing is that the only way they can buy the government debt is they have to have Australian dollars. It's just Australian dollars are being returned to the government is what happens when the government borrows money. All right, what does it mean when a country goes bankrupt? This doesn't happen a lot, but it has happened. And I guess it happens because a country is unable to pay its debts. Countries run into problems when they borrow money not in their own currency. So like an example is maybe say Argentina. If they borrow lots of US dollars, when that US dollar denominated debt comes due, because of the Argentinian government cannot create US dollars, it needs to acquire them somewhere. If it doesn't have them, then it goes bankrupt. And so that's the same, with like you and I, like if we borrow money and we don't have the money to be able to pay it back, you run into trouble. But for say like Australia, as long as the Australian government only ever borrows money or issues debt in Australian dollars, when that debt comes due, the government just creates more Australian dollars to pay it back. All right, why is it important to understand how the government spends money in Australia? Why I actually got interested in this and understanding it is it speaks to like what kind of society we want to live in and what kind of world we want to live in. And it's important for me that people know that the government can spend as much money as it wants, because lots of our public policy debate gets, in my view, needlessly constrained by asking the wrong question. And that wrong question is, where's the money going to come from? And for the government, that doesn't matter. The better question and what government should actually be asking themselves is like, what's the effect of this spending going to be? And the biggest concern, or the thing that should be at the forefront of their thinking, is like, will this spending create inflation? If you actually look at the history of and how much governments have actually spent, it doesn't actually matter which political persuasion you are. Most governments spend more than they collect in tax. That's fine. That's fine. It doesn't matter that the government has a deficit, because once you realise that it's not a question of finding the money, then, if there needs to be new hospitals or schools built or more money in aged care, like all of these opportunities open up. So that's why I get passionate about it. I feel like I could have probably answered that a little bit shorter, but there you go.